o'clock. Okay, so we got a half an hour. Okay. So, the book of Ruth. Who actually read the book of Ruth? That's a good number. Okay. So, who can give a really good 2-sentence summary of Ruth? Yeah. Some part of it. Okay. What stood out to you about the book of Ruth?
Whither thou goest, I will go.
Goes with their mother-in-law.
In-law.
So she goes with her mother-in-law.
Can you
right.
repeat what they said? I can't hear
Right.
you.
So, wherever you go, I will go with you.
Whether thou goest, thou
Right.
goest.
And so that's Ruth talking to her mother-in-law, Naomi. So why did she want to go with her mother-in-law, Naomi?
So for me, it's about the covenant. She marries Naomi's child. There's a covenant made with the son, and she wants to honor the covenant, which includes caring for her mother-in-law. So for me, it's the entire book is about human covenant.
Okay. What about human covenant?
Me to answer that now?
Yeah.
I'm trying not to talk too much. So coming from my own perspective, all we have are each other. So human covenant is a holy thing, a thing to be held up, to be honored, because, from my perspective, we can't really rely on anyone other than our fellow humans. So to me, it's the highest promise. And also in some ways it serves as a model for the covenant between God and God's people, if that's your belief system. And it's just one way to demonstrate how that might work.
Okay. So the thing is, we still haven't gotten through the sort of summary of the story. What's that?
That's what you asked for.
Right. So, Maggie, can you summarize it?
So Naomi marries and has 2 sons, and they leave their home and go to a new land, and her sons grow up and get married. Her husband dies, and 10 years later her sons die, and after a while she decides that she wants to go back home. She tells her daughters-in-law, Orpah, and Ruth, to stay in their land and not come back with her to her land, and Orpah stays and Ruth goes with Naomi. And then when Naomi gets home, I don't understand the last part of it, but she says, don't call me Naomi anymore because God was bad to me. God was created disaster in my life. Therefore I can't be Naomi.
And that's only half of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens after that?
Oh,
That's
that's
the
the only
only
part
half
I,
is the creation of the house of David.
So it ends with the creation of the house of David. What happens in between?
that wasn't the part that you sent out and printed.
Yeah,
It didn't get in my part.
So what happens is they go back and Ruth meets a man, and he marries Ruth and helps care for Naomi in her, or Mara, in her old age. That's how that led. So she becomes, I don't know if she becomes Jewish, but she becomes part of the Jewish family. Like, that's my understanding.
Okay.
Do you want to add some of the just the salacious part? When I said we're missing all the best parts. Which is that Ruth catches Boaz's eye while she's has the poorest job possible, which is she's basically going after the gleaners who have picked up the large gathered bunches of.
Right. So she's a gleaner going after the harvesters.
She's literally like a trash picker. Like she's getting the remains, and even from that position, she gets Boaz's eye. And then the whole idea is that Naomi and Mara, she gives her man catching lessons and tells her what to do, and it's all about.
Right, and Boaz is a relation.
Yeah, so
He's a relative.
So Naomi is gonna capitalize off of that and sort of puts Ruth in this it's a vulnerable position. So that the way the story tells it is that she sneaks into his chamber and uncovers his feet.
Your air quotes.
Exactly, yeah, which is exactly as suggestive as you can imagine for the time. So it's just this kind of intriguing story of putting herself in a real place of sexual vulnerability, basically to put herself in a place where she could get the grace of Boaz, who of course, then the whole idea is that he treats her honorably. Something that gets picked up later in the Joseph narrative, but
so Naomi has given her advice on how to catch a man, basically.
Yeah.
But Boaz, the man Naomi wants her to catch, has also offered her protection.
He
from
takes the
men
most
that would do
noble
her
way.
harm in the field.
He doesn't. He tells them to leave extra stocks behind, and then once everything gets consummated, he treats her as a suitable companion as opposed to just a booty call. So. I mean, because that's really that's what it could have been. It could have been this is just a useful sexual tool or instrument, but instead it becomes this more redeemed story of she becomes part of the family, and then of course this is the Davidic line. So worth noting also, just I think is interesting is that you would be completely amiss looking in history for a romance earlier than this. Like this is actually like the real kernel history of romance telling. So
Absolutely.
it's like Song of Songs and this are like the earliest things we have that are just love stories. So which is kind of interesting on its own.
So where's the love story? Which is the love story? Is the love story Ruth and Naomi, or is the love story Ruth and Boaz?
Ruth and Naomi.
I think it's Ruth and Naomi.
So why? Like, what is it about this story that says romance and not mother-daughter covenant?
The way that she's taking care of her, like was mentioned earlier about the gleaning, she did that to care for her. I tried to find what I had read previously, but there was also something I read a while back where the specific in the original language, the word used for love was more similar to that between husband and wife.
So what do we know about that panel of experts? What do you want to say about this?
So, I found a really great book called Gleaning Ruth. Yeah.
Clever.
Hey, don't blame me. Blame Jennifer Kusid? I think so.
Okay.
A biblical, subtitled A Biblical Heroine and Her Afterlives. And I don't know if you can see it. I took a picture here of the cover, so if you see it at Barnes & Noble or whatever, you can find it. But chapter 4. Chapter 4 has some interesting words by a biblical commentator, Rebecca Alpert, who points out that if the words that Ruth spoke to Naomi and vice versa were spoken between a man and a woman, the romantic and sexual bond between the two would be assumed. I think is really interesting. That the story between the two of them is something, as Alpert points out, that has been looked to for an example of lesbian love for many people, and as Alpert looks at this, she actually does a queering of the story, but she says, we don't have to actually queer it because it already has so much potential within the text. But she says, she goes on to do a Jewish lesbian midrash on the text, which is explicit in saying, okay, so if they were the opposite gender, we would just naturally assume that they were lovers. But let's just do a midrash, let's do a reading where we say that they are lovers, which for the lesbian community, this is not implausible. That's a direct quote. So she sits. When I say midrash, is that a term that's comfortable, familiar? No? Okay. So it's a Jewish tradition. It's an imaginative reconstruction of the text. And the point to a midrash, as this really is really good at explaining, is not to uncover the history of the text, but to uncover the possibilities within the text, within the tradition. So within the bounds of the tradition, to uncover the possibilities within the text. So we're not necessarily doing a historical reconstruction, but we're looking at what could possibly exist within the text, within the tradition. And Alpert says, making room for lesbian interpretations of the Book of Ruth is a way of welcoming lesbians into the contemporary Jewish community. In every generation, the concerns of the Jewish community are expressed through its midrash. So it's a way of each generation to express and breathe new life into Scripture and understand contemporary issues, concerns, and see themselves within the text. Now, one of the things that stood out, and you ought to go get this because it is really interesting because it goes through and it talks about it's got in here several different authors that are interpreting the text and looking at the different possibilities. So not just from a lesbian example, but also from a bisexual, because again, these terms don't exist, but we're doing a midrash, so we're looking at it from a 21st century perspective. So I know I just told you don't do this, and now I'm doing it.
I was just going to ask about that.
Yeah, because we're in the queering portion. We've done, remember, this is the
But it brings up
queering.
a really good question.
Yeah.
Why is taking Paul out of context and applying current standards not okay, but then updating Ruth as a midrash somehow okay?
That's a great question. So, why is it not okay to do that? Well, one of the reasons it's not okay is because it's presented as though that's what Paul said, whereas a midrash like this is presented as this is a imaginative understanding of the text within the bounds of tradition. So this is true to what it is, where the other one is not true to the reading of the text. So there are different ways of approaching the text, and the one is not honest to what it is.
Well, and I think the other thing about it is it goes back to, where is he? He's gone. Our brother John from Jefferson, what he said the first week is that, where is he? In the back. Oh, in the back.
He just
He
is
was
moved.
right in the center before.
Yeah.
So what did you say the first week, John?
Probably horse crap. What?
You said something really good about coming into this conversation to create more love, rather than using any of these words or texts to hurt. They were using them to heal instead of to hurt.
And I think that that's the bottom line, that if you're reading the Bible to hurt somebody, you're doing it wrong. So when I read these different interpreters who are doing these midrashes, and they're doing it, for example, Mona West says Ruth is our queer ancestress, and Selena Duncan does a bisexual midrash. As I read this and about creating space for the lesbian community, you read this is about creating space for love, acceptance, maybe even survival for some. That's completely different than reading Paul to create hate, division. It's a completely different thing, and that's even beyond the level of the difference between a midrash and pretending to do biblical interpretation.
I don't think I need that, but I'll hold it anyway. Ruth and Naomi, I don't see it as being, what do I want to say, a lesbian type thing. I think more a cultural thing, whereas I wouldn't want to go with my mother-in-law, and I wouldn't want to move in with her, but when I was in Africa, that was expected. When you married, you moved in to your mother-in-law's house and lived there until she said it was okay to leave.
A lot of cultures have that.
Yeah, without a doubt, lots of cultures have an expectation that a daughter or daughter-in-law or son or
Goes to the
son-in-law
husband's
will
house.
take care of the parent, right? And there's something about what you said that made me think about what makes a couple, and does it have to be a sexual relationship, right? Could it be Bert and Ernie or Felix and Oscar, right? I mean, I was just visiting my niece in California last week, and she lives with her grandmother, and they're like an old married couple,
Yeah.
right? And it's a perfectly normal, regular mother, grandmother, granddaughter relationship.
Right.
And in some countries like Belgium, if you want to get the equivalent of what is our Social Security for your spouse, it has to be your spouse. But in Belgium, you can get it because my aunt has moved in with me, so we can get it for both of us because she's my aunt. Has nothing to do that you're married.
Yeah.
Or if it happens to be, the next door neighbor person, then that's fine. You can get it because you are taking care of someone else. It doesn't have to be because it's a sexual or a marriage type thing.
Yeah.
Yay, Belgium.
Well, my late brother-in-law had what my husband and I jokingly call a non-sexual life partner who was a man, and they were both straight men, and they were actually talking about getting married because it would be legal and they could get each other's benefits. Is that not a couple? Right. So what are the commitments that people make to each other? How covenantal is that? I think it goes back to what Joe was saying earlier about the thing that really stands out here is the covenant they make with each other. And it seems like this.
No, I think you're blocking the signal at the bottom.
Oh, is that what I'm doing?
Yes.
There we go. Now I know with the mic. Now that we're done.
You're hired.
What was I
It
going to
goes back
say?
to the covenant.
Talking about
It goes back to the covenant.
Yeah, going back to the covenant. Oh, and I know the times when I've used, David and Jonathan for a wedding of two men, or I've used Ruth and Naomi in the wedding of two women. It brings them comfort, and it's the commitment that these two people of the same gender have to each other that brings a sense of, I don't know, not legitimacy, but a kind of authenticity. Like these kinds of committed relationships between people of the same sex, no matter what we call them and whether they involve sexual intercourse or not, are real. And they go back thousands of years. And that's worth holding on to.
There's a big piece of this story that's about justice and about the law bringing about justice and restoration and people doing the law right and not doing it wrong, right? The reason that Naomi goes back to Judah is that she has no one, her husband's supposed to care for her. And when her husband dies, her sons are supposed to care for her. And when they die, she's got no one to care for her. So for her social safety, for her care, she needs to go back to her people, to her tribe, her clan, and find the Goel. It's the Hebrew for redeemer, the one who has to redeem her, the one who's responsible for her, to take care of her, because she's now a widow and needs to be cared for. And there's no one to do that except in extended family. So that's why she goes back. And she tells her two daughters-in-law, stay here with your people. You're both Moabites. Do your Moabite thing. Let your families take care of you, because that's, again, how women were treated, right? They needed a man to care for them. That was the culture. And Orpah's like, gotcha, you're right. I'll go to my family. And Ruth is like, no, I'm going to go with you. I'm staking my claim with you. I'm going to trust your God and your people to do the right thing. And when they get back, the gleaning of the fields, the law said you had to leave the edge of your field so that people who were in need could glean and have food for themselves. That was like a tax, right? It was a tax for the poor. It was the contribution you were supposed to make. And Boaz has to tell his guys, leave her alone, right? So it's the law, but they're still looking down on the poor and are going to abuse her or whatever. Boaz stands up and does the right thing. right? He becomes the hero of the story, even though he's not the Goel. He's not the next of kin. He's not the Redeemer. It's somebody else. And it's because Naomi sees that in this guy and says, here's a righteous dude, let's go for him, right? He's the one who's going to do right by us, because the Redeemer had not done his job yet. And Boaz has to go to that person, and they strike a whole covenant. They do the thing with the sandal. It's a really weird legal thing, but here's my sandal. And so effectively, Boaz says, I'll do the redeeming. I'll take that. But he honors the law. It says, it's your place to marry her and care for her, but I'm willing to do that if you're willing to allow me. So the whole story is about people saying, we're going to do the right thing within the law, and the law provides for that. That's what justice is. So it's a great story about how if you do the loving thing, you can do the just thing. You don't have to fight against it, that justice actually supports this loving relationship. It's really cool. And it's the answer to Judges, which is really, really awful. When you read the next book, you're like, oh, good. Because the book of Judges ends with the line, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king. And in the ordering of Hebrew scripture, the next book is 1 Samuel. It goes into the story of the king. But in the Christian ordering of scripture, we put Ruth in there because historically it happens in that period of time between Judges and Samuel. But it also provides this wonderful way of taking a deep breath after the book of Judges, saying, oh, maybe some people do what's right because it's right and it's loving, and it's a great antidote to that.
No, go ahead.
Then I have to run.
Don't trip.
Well, and I've always been taken by the very last part, where after the child is born, Naomi takes the child to nurse. And, which is pretty amazing when you think about it right there. But I take it not just as being a wet nurse, by becoming the nurse, she now claims this child as her offspring, so that it is the offspring of her husband and her sons, and now it's the family line. And so that changes the whole thing. And how that then goes back to the rules within the Judaic faith about how you treat widows and how you keep the family line going.
In the mythological telling, right, the mythological imagination of that story is that the child then becomes one of those miracle babies. It's the barren woman who has a child. I mean, it's that imagery in the story. So.
Just as I was reading this again, I'm very struck by Ruth's commitment to Naomi in the beginning of the book, right, where she just, she could have very easily said, oh yeah, okay, go ahead, I'll see ya. But instead she says, not only did she say, you know what, I'm gonna go with you. She says, where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Mm-hmm. Like that is such a depth of commitment to another person, and she commits, and then she follows that commitment through. She follows it in saying, and listening as they go back to Naomi, who says, this is how it works. You can go to the threshing floor and go to Boaz and then do these things. And Ruth loves her and trusts her and does these things, and the story unfolds because of this, the covenant, the love, the trust that goes into that relationship. And I can't, you had mentioned about, Denny, you had mentioned the David and Jonathan text that you use in weddings. And I have not used that text, but this one I have. And I kept thinking about you saying that you would use that other text, and I kept thinking about the amazing love and commitment that this text holds between these two women and how incredibly beautiful that is for a couple.
So one of the things that strikes me is what you said earlier, Ian, about how you always know who your mother is when you're not sure who the father is, so there's gotta be this purity, and just the way that you talked about it, it's as if there was mistrust built into the relationship. And somehow Naomi and Ruth, because there was no worry about who a father might be, who the father of a child might be as an outcome of their relationship, it put it on a whole different level. They could really be present to each other without any intrigue or mistrust. It's a totally different kind of relationship.
And they need Boaz so that there'll be a child.
And they need Boaz so that there'll be a child.
Right. Because that's how the story ends.
Yeah.
As we pointed out, it's that child is the happy ending of the story, because that's the promise. That's where they'll be cared for, because now there's a child.
He will be your restorer of
Yeah.
life.
Restorer of life.
Yeah.
Yeah. He shall be, this all would declare, he shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more than you can, who is more to you than even sons, has borne him. It's really hard to read. The glare is terrible.
There are two of the Bibles.
So the son was named Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And of course, we know who David led to. So what time is it now?
8:25.
Ooh, 8:27, okay. So, this little class has been really interesting, hasn't it? We started as the four of us because somebody from my congregation came and said, gee, I would really love a Bible study that would be welcoming and nurturing of LGBTQ people. And all three of these folks at some point had said to me, gee, what can we as a cluster of colleagues do to serve the LGBTQ community here in and around Kirtland? So they were the first people that I went to. And the thing that's been really interesting is that other ministers from other congregations have shown up. And when I look at this list, there are actually 9 different congregations represented in this room, which is really pretty awesome. So we're learning here, hopefully more than you're learning. I asked earlier if there's anything you'd like us to address, and I hope that we can address trans issues better. I mean, it's still, in the scope, in the arc of history of the Western Hemisphere, the idea of transgender is still a really new thing in a lot of ways. We haven't really had the language for it until fairly recently. So hopefully we can be inclusive and expansive and inviting and loving and really address that. So there is that. So something has come up this evening, and a few people had asked me if they could make announcements about events that they have going on. And what I'm wondering is, would anybody have any objection to a couple of quick announcements about events happening that could be of interest to all of us? Okay, no objections to that? I know Kathy Dean and I think also Kathy Flora had events going on. So if you want to, real quickly.
This is for anyone that likes to take a walk on the beach. East Shore twice a year does a Headlands Beach cleanup. We're on the beach for about an hour and a half. It's fairly quick, but lots of fun. And then afterwards, anyone that's interested in bringing a lunch and beverage, there's places that you can have a nice lunch. So it's not an all-day thing, but it's a lot of fun and it's worthwhile. And if anyone is interested, I have a handout that tells where we meet, the time, and all the information.
So Metter Headlands, the morning of May 18th, right?
Yes.
Okay. Kathy.
Okay, there are 3,000 homeless children in Cleveland at any given time. The city mission is taking over, renting out Public Square on June 29th. And it'll be churches from all over bringing their congregations, even many of them their choirs. It'll be an information, there'll be games and music and food trucks and lots of security. It's family friendly, and there'll be stations so you can learn how it is to be homeless. It'll be a lot of fun, and we're looking for 3,000 people, so sign up.
So shedding light on and demanding action for 3,000 homeless children in Cleveland. Okay. Ian, you got something, right? I'd be shocked if you didn't.
I don't wanna go on you.
No, go ahead. I'm down with it.
All right, so tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Pete Seeger, and at the congregation I serve in Shaker Heights, we have Jim Scott, who's gonna play a Pete Seeger concert. Jim was a frequent musician in Pete's band, and so that's tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Door is 15 for adults, 10 for kids.
And that's the UU congregation in Shaker Heights.
Yeah, Shaker Heights, yeah.
On Monday begins Ramadan, and on the 22nd at 8 o'clock, that's is it Wednesday night? It's Wednesday night. Wednesday night, the 22nd, the Turkish American Society of Cleveland will be with us at Old South, and we will be hosting an iftar, a fast-breaking dinner, and everyone is invited. They eat really well at the iftar. It's a lot of fun, and it's a very friendly bunch, and there will be a speaker, and so we'll learn a little bit about Islam and share some time together. They're also doing other iftars in the area that are community like that. It's a tradition they've established, but there will be one here in Kirtland on the 22nd at 8 o'clock.
Directly.
Lynn.
Thank you. In August of 2016, the women of the Muslim Association of Cleveland and East Shore started a group called our Sisters Keepers. And we meet the first Sunday of every month at 2:30, and we alternate locations. This Sunday we will be meeting, May 5th, we'll be meeting at Muslim Association of Cleveland. It's over on Richmond, across from Richmond Hospital. And our topic this month is going to be Ramadan 101, since Ramadan starts that evening. And so our sisters are going to talk about what they do to prepare for Ramadan.
Anything else? Because boy, wouldn't it be nice if after this class we start showing up for each other in new and different ways. You know, Ian and I arrived in Kirtland on the same week 5 years ago. And this is something we've been talking about from the very beginning, getting more and more stuff happening between our congregations. So hopefully this can be a seed for that. So, so our fourth session. Oh, do you have something, Tina?
I was going to talk about next week.
Ah, please do.
A little bit. So, next week is in Fairport Harbor, and we're excited that you guys get to come and be with us. I wanted to just let you know, the address is right, it's 308 3rd Street on the flyer, and parking is on the street, it's on both sides of the street. We are on the south side of the park in Fairport Harbor, and so I'll have the front door open, the side door will also be open. We'll be in a fellowship hall, which is behind the sanctuary, so if you come in the front doors, you can look at the beautiful sanctuary and then come into the back. We'll be back there. And we will have some snacks because we can't help that. So there will be snacks. So we hope that you'll join us next week out in Fairport Harbor, and it'll be easy to find us, and we look forward to hosting. So thanks.
Cool. And we're gonna be, what are we looking at next week? Paul's new holiness codes from 1 Corinthians. So, yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 9 and 10, and then Timothy 1. What's that?
I have a suggestion for dealing with,
Okay.
to address transgender issues. I'm suggesting that we look at the book of Acts, chapter 8, starting with the 26th verse. It's the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. So we can talk about eunuchs and talk about.
What chapter is that again?
It's chapter 8 of the book of Acts. So if you can take a look at that, it's starting with 26th verse to the end of the chapter. And then we can talk about what it meant to be a eunuch and what purity code said about genitalia and that kind of thing. So I think there are issues that we could look at, so we could add that. I know it'll screw up our whole curriculum, but we'll,
No, it's great. No, it's great. We can certainly do that. And what I'd like to do too is send that information out to everybody on the email list and ask you guys to put together a bibliography that we can present on paper to folks for our last session.
and videos are on YouTube.
And videos are on YouTube. Videos are on YouTube.
Videos on YouTube. Google,
Cool.
look it up.
Thank you. So we've run a little bit late, but we'll see you next week, next Thursday, last class, Fairport Harbor. Thank you all.
Thank you.